Hi, I'm Ivan. I'm a creative practitioner here at Raffles Jakarta for the fashion design and fashion marketing and management faculty. Have you ever wondered what the fundamental basics for fashion is? Textiles plays a major role in fashion for both fashion design and fashion marketing. It is the most basic form of communication for the fashion industry. Why? Because we utilize textiles to convey our designs and ideas. Textiles, they start with fibers. That's the core of all textiles or yarns. So fibers comes first, yarns, and then only comes fabrics, which are textiles. What we will be doing today for today's workshop is weaving. What is weaving? Weaving is one of the oldest and most basic, most fundamental ways to create textiles. There are many methods that we use to weave, and we will have a combination of methods that I'll be showing you today, and hopefully you can try the weaving methods by yourself. So as I've mentioned, weaving is the most fundamental basic part of the fashion industry because with weaving, we create textiles, and with textiles, we create clothes that we wear. So what we are going to show you today is how you will do weaving samples like these, where they're fun, they're fast, they're quite interesting to make, and most importantly, they will show your creativity and it will spark your interest in fashion with textile making and how inspirational textiles can be, how important textiles can be. So before that, before we actually start the weaving process, let's show you a little bit of the materials that you will need to prepare for this weaving process. So first of all, most importantly, we need to have our looms. So what are looms? Looms are the mechanism or the quote-unquote machines that enable you to start with your weaving processes. So here we are going to create our looms with cardboards. These are just recycled cardboards that I have picked out and cut into squares. We will measure and make sure that our lines are even. So for example, this cardboard here is 16 centimeters in width. I will measure 16 centimeters and make markings. I will half this and make markings. This is 8 centimeters here and 8 centimeters here. And then I will go approximately 0.5 centimeters away from the original 8 centimeters. And that will be the point where I will do my cutting later on to create scores on this cardboard. It's a very simple process. Just make sure that the lines that you mark are parallel to one another. They need to be in a straight line. So I will make sure that I'm also leaving about 1.5 to 2 centimeters from the edge of the cardboard, making sure that I have enough space to hold my loom later on. So after you have marked your cardboards, it's time to score them or notch them. So what I have just created is a tiny little slit at the edge of the cardboard so that your threads can pass through later on. You'll see. So just have to continue scoring them, making sure that what I have here is the exact parallel to the top, like so. So once you're done with that, you'll have a homemade loom that looks like this. So everyone can start weaving fabrics at home. With this, the next step that we will have to look into, the next materials that we will need to look into are our yarns. These are yarns. You can purchase them fairly easily these days online, as we are all doing a lot of crafts at home, a lot of our projects at home. So yarns in many different colors, the more the merrier. Always good to keep a good stock at home. And these yarns will be used to create our warp and weft. We'll go into that in a little bit. Alright, so first, cardboard with scores with the markings, then yarns, then you need a snipper or a pair of scissors. Please be careful with these. Yeah, these are to cut our yarns like such, so small little yarns. And then we need to have a safety pin. The safety pin is used in place of a needle because with weaving, these are not to be stitched down onto the cardboards. They're going to pass through the cardboard. So with the safety pin, it's easier to grasp the yarns. I'll show you the methods in a bit. Alright, so we have cardboard, yarns, snippers, and your safety pin. So these are the few basic materials that you will be needing for weaving. So next, we will have to look at how to create your looms. So after you're done with scoring your looms like this, parallel rows, you will then use a base yarn. So the base yarn will need to be a little bit more sturdy. It needs to be a little bit rougher, right? So that when you are weaving, your yarns do not break. Because when your yarns break, you have to repeat the whole process again. So first, let's teach you how you are going to roll your yarns. First, I pass through the edge of the yarn into a slot right here. Then I hold it into place with my thumb. Then I go round my loom, like so. So you're basically going round and round. That's why the slots that we did earlier had to be parallel to one another. So make sure that they're parallel. And lastly, snip this off. Leave a little bit extra. Cut this off. And you will have to fasten these loose ends. Because if you are weaving without these fastened, they will slide right off. So you need to pull them tight and tie them. So how do you tie them? The top crosses the bottom to the other side. Place this thread, this yarn, into the middle, and you pull. So pull as tight as you can, not bending the cardboard slots. Then pass through the bottom yarn, go up on top, and tie a knot. You can snip off the excess as you please, or you can just leave them as it is. If you want it to be a little bit more secure, you can tie a double knot, pulling it at the same time. Alright, so that's how you do your looms at the beginning. So don't forget that you need to do it on both sides. Like so. Pull it, make sure it's tight, and then tie a knot. So you have your loom with yarns. Now, in terms of textiles or fabrics, these yarns that we just did, these are called your warp yarns. So in textiles, we have two sets of yarns. your warp yarns and your weft yarns. So when you are weaving, you are, for example, using a yarn to pass through your warp yarn at 90 degrees. So the basic yarns that we just did, that we just attached to the looms, those are your warps. The green ones are your wefts. So that's why your warp yarns needs to be a little bit stiffer, a little bit more rough, because you need them to be strong enough to withhold the constant rubbing of the weft yarns through your loom. So be quite mindful of that. You do not want to use a yarn that breaks off easily like these decorative yarns, right? So make sure that they're stiff enough and they hold their place, their shape in place. And then you can start your weaving processes. So how do I start my weaving? First of all, I will use another stiffer yarn. Remember, these yarns that we are now going to be progressing with are called your weft yarns. So they go left to right. Remember our safety pin at the beginning of the video? Put in the yarns into the safety pin, like so that you have an easier access to your yarns, versus you trying to pick the yarns up like this. So this safety pin is acting as what we call a shuttle. This will help you easily put your fabrics into the looms. So let's start with the most basic, which is your plain weave. The plain weave is a 1-to-1 ratio where you have one warp and one weft. So you're literally going up and down like this. So up, down, and you're going to pull it until you are satisfied with the position. When you're weaving, do not weave all the way to the edge. You should leave a bit of allowance, a little bit of ease here. So try not to pull it all the way to the end, but leave a little bit here. And it's alright to have excess peeking through at both edges. Alright? Then you can snip off your yarn and proceed with the other weft. The other weft will go in the opposite order of the previous yarn that you just did. So the first one was up, down, so which means the second weft that you'll be producing is down, up, up. So progress with this down, up motion using your weft yarns. Pass through, pull, leave a bit at the edge, and trim it off, like this. After you have done that, you realize that there are spaces, there are gaps in between each weft. So you will need to push them closer to each other. Make sure that they touch, because we want our fabrics in the end to be not as porous as our conventional knitted garments. Yeah, this is weaving, not knitting. Alright, so this is what you will get with your warp and weft yarns. So the next technique that you can try is the same movement with the up down movement with the weft lines, but in this case we actually fasten the yarns to the loom. So you can tie a knot like this to the edge, snip off the excess, and weave in the same motion as before. So if you were to knot this at the edge, this is considered an up motion. So the next yarn goes down, up, down, up. when you pull this, make sure that you do not pull it too tight, as the yarns will cross each other like this. We don't want this. We want the looms to have balanced warp lines. So make sure that they are not too tightly pulled. It's just eased like this. Alright, then you can proceed with the other weft. So this one was down, so go up again, down, up, down, up. Down, up, down, up. Okay, so make sure that you ease this back. Please do make sure that it does not pull too tightly. Alright, so as you can see, we have two sets of weft yarns now. Make sure that you push them close to each other. Alright, so this is basically how all fabrics are made, by weaving the warp and the weft together. What you will have later on, when you proceed with other wefts, will be something that looks like this. So here I've done different techniques of the wefts. This and this was done using the same technique that I just showed you. But using the same up-down motions, you can play with the amount of the ratio that you will be doing. For example, this sequence was 1:3. So 1 warp is equals to 3 wefts. 1 warp equals to 3 wefts that are visible. Alright, so these are the sequences that you can experiment with. Let me show you that. Tie your yarn, your weft yarn, to your loom like this, and then you move it horizontally. Now remember, it's much easier if you use your safety pin as your shuttle. So 1:3. 1 warp, 3 wefts. 1 warp, 3 wefts. And there you have your weft on your loom. Next, you will proceed with the other weft. Now this time I'll show you without the shuttle. So what you will do if you do not use a safety pin. So it's the opposite, right? We started off with 1:3. So now let's do 1 and 3. 1 and 3. 1 and 3. 1 and 3. And when you will pull your weft yarns, it forms an interlock between each other. Like this. Alright? So these are something like this. Alright? You can see that they are going across each other. Okay, so after we have done the first type of basic weaving techniques, which was the up down movement, that's called the plain weave, the most simple ratio. Plain weave is 1:1. So one warp equals to one weft, one warp, one weft. Alright, that's visible. The other technique that I'm going to show you is the knotting technique. So you will need to create a knot at the end of your loom, at the edge, create a loop, right? As you can see, a loop. Loop this into the last warp thread, pull, and tie. Make sure to fasten this. Make sure that it's tight. And then create another loop. So what I do is I pull my fingers through and pinch, which creates a loop effect. Pass through and go into the next yarn. And pull. Make sure that it's tight. So this creates knots on your loom. You can knot each of these warps, or you can knot at an interval. So one knot, skip one warp, and then loop the other warp that you will end up with later on. So here, create a loop. Here. So we have skipped one warp here. And then move on to the next warp. Make sure that you pull it tight. Alright, so once you're done with knotting, you realize that knotting is almost the same when you buy a sweater and when you wear a sweater. When you were stretching the fabric, it's much more stretchable. It's much more elastic. See, it opens up the loops. So that's why this knotting technique is good for creating your knits that are a little bit more, your weaves that are a little bit more stretchy. Okay, so once you're satisfied with your knots, you can combine your knots together with your basic weaves. Combining them creates a design for your weaving. So now I'm going to use a decorative yarn. This decorative yarn comes in many different colors. It has a velvety texture to it, and it's thicker than your usual yarns that we have just used before. These are decorative yarns. Now, what you do is you loop your yarn onto your warp, pull, and knot. So you knot it onto your loom, fasten the knot, and start your weave. You can weave it in a plain weave, which is 1:1. It creates a different outcome from what you did previously, because these yarns are much thicker. So as we are mentioning about yarns, what are yarns? Yarns are made out of tiny fibers. These are fibers that you can actually unravel from your yarn. So these fibers, when combined with each other, they create a strand of yarn. So the basic unit is fiber. These are fibers. fiber, yarn, and then when you combine yarn together, they create textiles or fabrics. Okay, so that's how textiles or fabrics are made. Then you are going to continue with the weaving with this up-down motion until the end of your loom. Make sure when you are pulling the wefts that it is not too tight, because pulling it too tight will create a tension at the sides. So please make sure that you are making them just nice. Don't worry if they are a little bit wonky in the middle. It's perfectly fine because you're going to layer a few more layers of weaving on top. You do not have to use the before mentioned 1:1 ratio. You can always create a pattern, a free-form pattern of your own. This is where your creativity comes. This is where you can show your aesthetics. You will be doing the same movements again. Basically, weaving is the intersection between the warp and the wefts at a 90-degree interval. Pull and pull. Make sure that the edges are not too tight. You can loosen them up by pulling on them. Make sure that they are balanced, and you can push these excess yarns down, locking them into place, and continuing again with the next row. Again, please remember, do not pull it too tight, as they will pull the warps. So create this again and again, over and over, one on top of each other. Weaving is quite a calming and therapeutic exercise because it lets your creativity flow out as you are doing a project where you can see instant results. You can instantly see what your mind has in store is creating for you on your behalf. So let your weaving creativity run free. You can weave in any sequence as long as your yarns are interlocking your warps. And that's called the warp and weft. Weft is the one that goes horizontally. Warp goes vertically. Alright, so this is one section of my weaving. I can use a different color yarn. And instead of going in a horizontal line, I can create lines diagonally. And I can skip yarns by going diagonally like this. Back to the second one. and forward again, like this. So you can actually do it diagonally. Yeah, this creates a zigzaggy effect. This can be done as well. Alright, so when you're done with that, you have rows of different colored weaves in different patterns. And what you will end up with can be something similar to this, which I've woven with the same techniques that I've shown you, just with various yarns that I have over here. This goes all in a plain weave technique. It goes horizontally from left to right, passing through the warps. Right, so this is what I did earlier, using the same techniques that I've just shown you. And what makes it interesting and what shows your creativity is the usage of your colors, of the textures of various yarns when they merge and join together. Then we have something that looks like this, where it's more free-form. This shows you different swirls. Your lines are not in a straight line, they're in a curved line. And I've made fringes as well. Let me now show you how to make fringes, which you can try later on. Use any yarns, perhaps leftover yarns. You can cut a certain amount and loop this strand of yarn. You can start with one strand first, like this, one single strand. Then I'll show you a double strand. Which is this. What the difference is between a single strand and a double strand. So with a single strand, fold this yarn into half, make a loop, create a loop, insert it into your warp, pull it tight, pass the yarn into the loop, and pull. You have a fringe. Like this. Alright, so what's the difference between a single strand and double strand? Well, you saw how thin the single strand was. With the double strand, same technique, push your loop, pull the strand of yarn, fasten it tight. So this creates your fringe, like this. And what I did was, I trimmed my yarns. Make them shorter. You can unravel your yarns to make it fluffier. You can see that there are many plies of yarns that are twisted together. You can untwist them. That untwisting process is called the unraveling process. Like so. So once everything's done, you end up with fluffy fringes. Like this. So I have here the fringe, the knots, the plain weaves. I have a basket weave over here, and I also have a twill weave at the bottom, which we are just playing with the ratios. The twill weave ratio is 2:2. So that means 2 warps with 2 wefts. Alright, that's the 2:2 ratio. Okay, so at the end of this whole exercise, you will end up with a piece of textile. This itself is already a textile, because if you have this weave as, let's say, a meter, 1.5 meters fabric, you will be actually able to cut your patterns out and make clothing from the textiles that you have just made. Now, you need to understand what the grain line is. When we are cutting patterns, when we are making patterns, making clothes in fashion, we look at the grain lines. The warp that we just did is called a grain. So this is your grain line. The line that goes across 90 degrees is your weft. And any excess loops at the edge of your textile is called the selvage. So we have the grain, which is the warp, the weft that goes across, and the selvage that is at the edge of the fabric. Okay? And when you pull your fabric on a 45 degrees, so at the edge of one of each sides, you realize that the fabric is really stretchable. It stretches like this. Whereas if you pull it on grain, not so much. Not much movement, right? Because the 45-degree angle that goes across the fabric is known as the bias. The bias will create extremely stretchable fabrics, but we have to be quite careful because sometimes they stretch and they do not get back in place. Especially with a weave like this, a loose weave like this. So you have to be quite mindful of that. Alright? So that's the end of the weaving process. I hope you have learned more about weaving and what it takes to create a piece of fabric. Okay? And hopefully you'll try these techniques. Please feel free to ask us any questions and we will help you. We'll help answer your questions. Okay? Thank you very much.